became the focus of respectable anti-Semitism. To the point where the Israeli former prisoner, human rights prisoner of the Soviet Union, and political leader Natan Sharansky defined a new form of anti-Semitism that he also used the letter D to summarize, saying that if you end up demonizing the state of Israel or Jews through the state of Israel, if you apply a double standard, and if you delegitimize the existence of the state of Israel in comparison to any other country or any other group, then you have embraced the new anti-Semitism. So this is where we stood until about a decade ago, when a wave of anti-Semitism began hitting Europe first, that everyone was unprepared for. Cemeteries were vandalized, there was violence, and all of a sudden we realized, those of us working in the field, that while Sharansky had talked about this new form of anti-Semitism and given us sort of a metric for it, nonetheless, we were still in a position where people were looking only at the old form of anti-Semitism and basically saying if you didn't see a neo-Nazi behind it, it wasn't anti-Semitic. We had to come up with something else. And that's where I came into the picture, because in 2000, the Prime Minister of Sweden had, for various reasons, decided he wanted to have the very first conference, political conference of the new millennium, dealing with the Holocaust. So in January of 2000, representatives of over 50 countries, high level, heads of state, foreign ministers, and so on, got together in Stockholm for what was called the Stockholm Forum. And out of that, 5 countries initially, and then joined by others now up to 34, created what is now known as the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. The IHRA is a very interesting group. I've been a part of the US delegation to it since it began. And what's interesting about it is, first of all, it's the only international body, intergovernmental body, that deals specifically and only with the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. Its agenda does not include human rights or economic issues or technology or any of the other things that are of vital importance. It deals only with the 2 things that I mentioned, Holocaust and anti-Semitism. And the delegation is political. It's a political body. To join it, countries that apply have to have a letter of application signed by either the head of state or foreign minister. And they have to commit to 3 things. They have to commit to opening all their World War II era archives, to creating a national day of commemoration, it can vary from country to country, in memory of the victims of the Holocaust from that country, and in putting education about the Holocaust into their national curriculum. That's the requirement. The delegations are mixed. They're headed, again, by a senior diplomat, usually foreign ministry level ambassador or something like that. And they're also composed of selected experts. So I've been, as I mentioned, as you heard, a member of the US delegation since it began. And in the year 2008, we began working on something that took 5 years to get through. IHRA operates by consensus. Consensus in that world means that all the countries, all the members have to agree to something before it becomes officially adopted. If one chooses not to, it's blocked. And what we started working on was a working definition of Holocaust denial and distortion. Because we realized that this was a pressing issue that was directly related to our work, our mandate, and if we weren't going to do it, no one else was going to do it. Why was it so pressing? Holocaust denial had been around for a number of years. And in a highlight case in 2000, the British pseudo-historian David Irving sued the American historian Deborah Lipstadt and lost a major case in a British court where the judge ruled that he was effectively a neo-Nazi and an anti-Semite and a distorter of history. And that, while ruined his reputation and pushed Holocaust denial to the fringes of the world, except for Iran and a couple of places like that where it's still a major part of public policy, it nonetheless took out that form of anti-Semitism off the agenda, off the mainstream, but it opened up the door for people to play with other forms. And that included countries that, for example, did not deny that the Holocaust never took place, but said that we had no part of it. It was just those Germans who were part of it. There were no local collaborators. There was no anti-Semitism in our country, and started distorting history for their own purposes. So we put together a working definition of Holocaust denial and distortion, and it took 5 years to get it through, because we had to get every government to agree to it, and there were a few governments that presented major roadblocks. But we did. At the end of that period, in 2013, a couple of us looked at each other and said, well, we've achieved something that we never thought we'd achieve. It was a long, hard road. What do we do next? And the answer was, we need to address anti-Semitism. So we took a definition of anti-Semitism that had been around from 2004, but never had any formal status. We tweaked it a little, adopted it a little, moved it around a little bit, and it took 3 years, and then it was finally adopted in Bucharest in 2016. That is the IHRA working definition of Holocaust denial and distortion. I am not going to give you the whole definition, because I will hold it up. Working definition of anti-Semitism. Because if I hold it up, you can see that it's 2 pages long, so I'm not going to give it to you. But it has a descriptive part, followed by a number of examples. Some include examples related to the classical anti-Semitism that we spoke about. Others include examples related to Israel. So for example, if you accuse Israel of committing acts of genocide, such as the Nazis, that is a form of anti-Semitism, because it is so far from the reality that the only way you can classify it is an intent, anti-Semitic intent. And it became what we thought was a highly successful achievement to be used by the IRA countries in their dealings with IRA. We didn't expect it to strike a chord the way it did. And a few months later, the United Kingdom announced that they were adopting it officially for their own government use throughout the United Kingdom. It's now been adopted by over 200 municipalities in the United Kingdom as well as other universities, the number of universities, and so on. The list of countries that have adopted it has continued to grow. It includes the UK, Israel, Austria, Romania, Germany, Bulgaria, Belgium, Slovenia, Sweden, Lithuania, Republic of North Macedonia, Netherlands, Slovakia, Moldova, Czech Republic, Hungary. Hungary was just past February. Canada, just past June. Luxembourg, also June. Greece, also this past November. France, December 2019. Cyprus, Italy, just a couple of weeks ago, January. Sweden, 21st of January. Uruguay, 27th of January. We're up to over 20 countries that have adopted it in North America and South America and Europe. In the United States, it has been adopted and posted on the State Department's website. The United Nations, the Secretary General, drew positive notice to it a couple of years ago, and this past fall, in a report by the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief on Anti-Semitism in the United Nations, he recommended that the UN adopt it for their use as well. The European Parliament adopted a resolution that calls on member states to adopt and apply the definition of anti-Semitism. And I could go on, but I will tell you that none of that pales to the fact that Wikipedia has called it the most widely adopted definition of anti-Semitism around the world. So we know it's highly successful if Wikipedia says so. But it is not without its detractors. And so one of the groups that has attacked it and targeted it the most are those affiliated with the so-called BDS movement. BDS stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, and it is a movement that attempts to force people to withdraw support, participation, and cooperation with the Israeli state, Israeli institutions, Israeli people, and sometimes Jews. The question arises if BDS is inherently anti-Semitic. So I'll tell you, in theory, it doesn't have to be. In practice, it's always been. And if you look at it, you will see that part of the reason is that it directly clashes with the IRA definition. So, for example, BDS claims that Israel is committing active genocide against the Palestinians. That's exactly what IRA would call an anti-Semitic statement. And I have to tell you that one of the first things in the IRA definition, right after the description of anti-Semitism there, is the sentence, and I'm going to go back and read this because it's crucial. Criticism of Israel, similar to that level against any other country, cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. It is the distinction, the double standard, where if the only country you're talking about boycotting, if the only country you're talking about divestment from is Israel, then there's a problem there. Muslims in France are treated terribly in many ways, as second-class or worse citizens, with economic and social discrimination rampant, and religious discrimination. But I've yet to see a call for boycotting French wines or cheese. And we can continue with other examples. So the target has been that the definition, precisely because of its success, has become a prime target. And initially, the claim was meant that it was meant to inhibit and criminalize anti-Israel protest and criticism. But as you heard, the definition does nothing of the sort. And then they claim that only the description part, not the examples, apply. I can tell you, being the person who introduced it and guided it through, and together with the Romanian diplomat who was chair of IRA at the time, we both can affirm, he unfortunately passed away 2 years ago, we can both affirm that the entire text is the entire definition. It is not separate. It's not pick and choose. That is the IRA definition. And so we now see that the claims are laid out, that it is un-American, that it targets one group of Americans unfairly, that it is something that is unconstitutional, and so on and so forth. The definition was cited by President Trump when he signed his executive order dealing with the protecting Jews on campus under Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And if you read the executive order carefully, it is not a challenge to American freedom of speech, because it is crafted very simply to refer to complaints of acts on campuses that need to be clarified whether they fall under the rubric of civil rights complaints or not, and the definition is to be used as the metric, or one of the metrics, for measuring that. It does not prevent anybody from saying what they want to say. It might set an example if someone is brought up after they committed an act that is judged to be anti-Semitic. But there's a very big distinction in American law between freedom of speech, which is highly protected, and the right to commit a civil rights infringement on somebody else. And the reason that President Trump had to bring it up and sign the executive order were two reasons, actually. One, because the preceding Civil Rights Act really was drawn in such a way that a lot of people read it as not to apply to anti-Semitism. It did not include religion, for example, as one of the protected categories. And this is where the definition of who is a Jew becomes tricky. Are Jews religion? They're atheist Jews. There are Jews who converted to other religions who claim still to be Jewish. Are Jews an ethnic group, a race? There are black Jews. There are Jews, Sephardic Jews. There are Jews of every skin color, and so on. So the categorization was very difficult. So by adding that, President Trump was trying to move the bars a little bit to make it wider as a protected class. But here's the other part. And I'm going to go back, so I'm going to start winding down now. The title of the talk tonight is The Evil Amongst Us. And while I think that most people, when you read it, thought of it as the evil in the United States and so on, and anti-Semitism, and you're right, there was another layer that I wanted to include in that. And that's the layer of us. And I want to get kind of political here in a non-political way. Because I want to show you and explain that part of the problem that we're dealing with now is when anti-Semitism becomes a political football. And that is where we're at in many ways, and that is part of the problem. So part of the reason that President Trump had to, or decided to make this executive order, was because the resolution that had been proposed to enact the exact thing that he was talking about doing, that he did in the executive order, which passed the Senate, I think almost unanimously bipartisan support, and had a huge bipartisan support in the House, was actually held up in its initial reading and hearing by the Republican chair of the House Judiciary Committee at that time, who was no longer in the House. And the Republican leadership did not want to bypass him and move the bill around or over him. So what President Trump actually had to do was kind of make up for the roadblock that members of his own party had put in place. And my point with that is not to point fingers specifically, but I'm going to point fingers generally. And to tell you that anti-Semitism is a problem in both parties, in the right and the left. We hear about the squad, the 4 Democratic congresswomen who are all considered to be lumped together, and some of them have made outright anti-Semitic statements. Some have not. But at the same time, there were 4 Republicans who ran for Congress in the 2018 elections who were outright Holocaust deniers and anti-Semites and neo-Nazis. Both parties have problems. I quoted Sharansky before. I want to quote him again. And it was Sharansky who said, and this is something that he's not the only one, he just says it better than most of us do, that if you really want to do something about fighting anti-Semitism, then if you're on the right, begin to fight it on the right first. If you're on the left, begin to fight it on the left first. If you just point fingers at the other house, then you're not really fighting anti-Semitism. You're playing politics. And you use anti-Semitism as a political tool. And that's not going to change anything. It's only going to make the situation worse. And we have to realize that not only is there anti-Semitism on the right and the left, but anti-Semitism is sometimes one of the few things that can bring together the extreme right and extreme left. And this is not new. Already in 2008, 2 quick examples. The former Attorney General of the United States, Ramsey Clark, who has been very much, he left the Johnson administration, protested the Vietnam War, and has been protesting wars, etc., and American imperialism ever since, was invited to a conference organized by a radical Islamist professor in Baltimore, and he was joined on the platform there, photographed very happily with one of America's leading neo-Nazis and leading Holocaust deniers. One of the leading critics of Israel these days is another woman named Alison Weir, who is generally perceived as being on the left. And yet Weir's publications have been published by, again, Holocaust denial sources, neo-Nazi sources, and she has no problem in bridging that gap itself. More recently, when it came to BDS support, there was a couple of, well, let me put it this way. There was a resolution passed in Congress last year, an anti-BDS resolution, supported essentially by 16 congressmen voted against it, and women voted against it. And obviously some members of the squad did. And by the way, just to show you that we can't make generalizations, one of the members, Ayanna Pressley from Massachusetts, did not go with the others and voted in favor of the resolution condemning BDS. So she was not in lockstep with the others all the way through. But nonetheless, we find at the same time that as strong as the Republican Party has been in many cases on supporting Israel, and as strong as the Democratic Party has been in many cases on supporting Israel, that the fringes are pulling on the sides. And so we have people like Nick Fuentes, one of the organizers of the Charlottesville March, a leader of the Groyper movement, which is the extreme far-right movement that's trying to push the Republican Party in a more extremist direction, who has come out in favor of BDS, opposing BDS laws, and is pushing from the right with support, for example, from the columnist Michelle Malkin, who also opposed laws condemning BDS. And they make this strange world where they're on the same side as far-left anti-Zionists. And the glue that holds them together is the anti-Semitism manifested as anti-Zionism. So I want to conclude with a couple of thoughts. The late Nobel Prize winner, Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel, is said to have written that Jews died at Auschwitz, but anti-Semitism did not die at Auschwitz. I was there in Auschwitz 10 days ago, January 27th, for the commemoration. And while I was there, one of the most moving statements was made by a survivor, and actually, this is what I was planning on doing. And I lost it originally, but found it. Who said, Marian Tursky, who said, well, that was what he said. Now it's coming through in Polish. Do not be, and this is a quote, do not be indifferent in the face of historical lies. Do not be indifferent when you see the past being exploited for needs of contemporary politics. Do not be indifferent when any minority suffers discrimination. For it's the essence of democracy that the majority wields the power, but at the same time the rights of the minority must be respected. Auschwitz did not suddenly fall down on you from the skies. The ground for it was prepared for many years in advance. What Tursky is saying applies to all of us. Indifference is the crime. The crime that we